the pre-draft process effectively starts when a men's basketball student athlete's season concludes. The UAC application deadline this year is April 12th. That date is set on our calendar. What is still to be determined at this point is the NBA's early entry deadline. And the reason that is to be determined is that as of the date of us filming this particular educational session, we have not set the date of the NBA draft. However, once that date is set, once the NBA draft date is set, the NBA's early entry deadline, based on the current language of our collective bargaining agreement with the Players Association, will be 60 days before the draft. So men's basketball student athletes can apply for UAC feedback. They can take the information they get back from the committee, talk to their coaches, talk to their family, and decide whether or not they ultimately want to enter the draft. They have to make that decision no later than 60 days before the NBA draft. Once that date comes, they have to decide whether or not they want to enter the draft, and to use NCAA terminology, test the waters. Once they enter the draft as an early entry candidate 60 days prior to the NBA draft, they still have the opportunity under NCAA rules to withdraw. And under NCAA rules, the time to withdraw is typically 10 days after the conclusion of the NBA draft combine. Now, that date also to be determined because we have not set the dates or the format of the 2021 NBA draft combine. But once we do that, that will provide more clarity as to when the NCAA's withdrawal deadline will fall. So those are the key dates and the timeline to kind of understand the broader context. So in terms of when we hear from the college basketball community the most in terms of trying to get some additional feedback, it typically falls at one of two times or both. We hear a lot from student athletes and coaches prior to the NBA's early entry application deadline, again, 60 days before the draft. And we hear a lot from student athletes while in the process of applying for feedback from the Undergraduate Advisory Committee. But again, the Undergraduate Advisory Committee process is intended as a build-up to the early entry deadline. It really is intended to help student athletes decide whether or not they want to test the waters or perhaps enter the draft and make that decision final. And so there's a lot of conversation around that time. They can always reach out to the league office. We're happy to have phone calls with coaches, with compliance officials, with the student athletes themselves. They can reach out via email for rule interpretations, or if they have questions about the details surrounding the UAC process. The UAC email account at the NBA league office is uac@nba.com. Again, that's uac@nba.com. So we are open for business, happy to talk, happy to help. A lot of conversation typically occurs, again, around the time that student athletes are applying for UAC feedback, deciding whether or not to enter the draft as an early entry candidate. And then things typically quiet down for a little bit and get active again, leading up to the combine and then the NCAA early entry withdrawal deadline, which is 10 days after the conclusion of the combine. And for those student athletes who have remained in the draft through the conclusion of the combine, they actually get updated written feedback from the Undergraduate Advisory Committee. So for student athletes who remain in the draft throughout the entirety of the pre-draft process, they will get 2 rounds of written feedback from the Undergraduate Advisory Committee. The first round they will receive prior to deciding whether or not to enter the NBA draft as an early entry candidate. And then the second round of feedback they'll get reasonably in advance of when they need to decide whether or not they want to definitively stay in the draft, in which case they would forgo the remainder of their NCAA eligibility.